Hello and a warm audience, a warm welcome to our audience. I'm Karin Plötz, and I'm very happy to introduce today three members of EUREAD. EUREAD is a consortium of European reading promotion organizations. Today we will talk about the reading promotion and the corona pandemic. ALDUS, the European Book Fairs Network, co-founded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union, supports this panel. The COVID-19 pandemic has created the largest disruption of education systems in history. For the world's most vulnerable students, school closures and continued school disruptions threaten their learnings and broadened the achievement gap. But what about reading? Did children and parents read more in time of lockdown, or did children prefer to play online games and were not interested in reading? And what about children who can't read and write properly? Are there differences concerning the consequences of the pandemic in Europe, in the European countries? These are the questions I'm going to discuss with three extraordinary people from Scotland, the Netherlands, and Germany. So welcome. Firstly, I want to welcome Professor Dr. Simone Ehmig. She is the head of the Institute for Research on Reading and Media, Stiftung Lesen in Mainz. A warm welcome. Secondly, a very warm welcome to Marc Lambert from Scotland. He's the CEO of Scottish Book Trust, and Scottish Book Trust is a Scottish national agency for the promotion of reading and writing. And last not least, and I'm very happy to welcome Daan Beeke from the Netherlands. He is domain specialist at Stichting Lesen and also the campaign manager of EUREAD. So we can discuss about the corona pandemic and reading promotion. First, the school closures during the corona pandemic had consequences. And I have a study from America. In America, primary age pupils are on average 5 months behind compared to where they should usually be in math and 4 months in reading, according to McKinsey. That's a study from July 2021. Professor Ehmig, how does it look in Germany? Are there similar numbers?
For schools, the federal states are responsible, and that makes it complicated. Many of the states decided to postpone the performance tests to the winter term, and that means that we only have few data from a few federal states, for example, from Hamburg. What we see is that especially the second period of school closure had a remarkable effect on children's performance in reading, as well as in other subjects like mathematics, for example. The main problem is that the share, the percentage of children with low reading skills is increasing. And it is a specific group of children. It's especially those who had been disadvantages before the pandemic. That means it's primarily children from families with a low socioeconomic status. It's children in families where parents have a low formal education, where they do not read aloud, where there are not many books, and these parents are not able, also if they want, they are not able to support their children as well as it would be good in this situation. They often do not have the space in their flats to have a quiet environment for a learning that would be helpful for them. They do not have digital devices for each child, and so on and so on. So the decision to close school for a longer period and for 2 longer periods has widened the gap between low and high performers.
Now about the Netherlands. The Netherlands could be a good best case scenario because they had a short lockdown, they had equitable school funding, and in the one of the world leading rates of internet access. Nevertheless, do we have numbers in children falling behind?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't know if there ever is a best case scenario in this crisis. You are right. We do have a lot of funding was there for schools. We'll talk about that later, I think. And as you say, I think the rates of people having access to digital media and also to internet are high in the Netherlands. But then we have the same problems as in Germany, I think, because this doesn't go for all children, and especially the children with low socioeconomic background. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's really depending on that how well they can benefit from this access, and also how much they will, let's say, fall behind if they don't have this. So also in the Netherlands, we had the same problem as you mentioned in the American studies. Kids were falling behind, as it turns out, because scientists looked into it. They fell behind exactly the period of the first lockdown, which is 1/5 of a school year. That was after the first lockdown, so they didn't progress during the lockdown. They looked at reading, spelling, and grammar, and especially reading was falling behind. And after the second lockdown, it was even worse. They performed well. Yeah, the numbers are not that interesting to you because I don't even know what they mean. But 17% percentile point less. That's what the research says. I mean, this does mean you can look this up. There's a source for it. I'm not just making this up. But it means they were performing less. And just like Professor Ehmig Simone just said, socioeconomic background was very important. So single children from single parents did worse, but also children from large families, they perform worse. Children with a migration background. So in that sense, the situation is very much the same. And I don't think. I mean, if this was the best case scenario, then still it wasn't positive.
But maybe Scotland was better.
Well, I'm afraid not. It's a very similar picture right across, I suspect, right across Europe, and in fact, you know, it's a general thing that is linked very, very strongly to postcode, where you grow up, which community you come from, and the socioeconomic status of that. We've been struggling with education in Scotland for quite a while. At least 1 in 5 children is not really learning to read properly. And the gap between the educational attainment of people from good backgrounds and people from deprived backgrounds is growing. So there's growing inequality there. And of course, the consequences of that are fairly catastrophic as far as society goes. So just to give you an example, and again, I feel it's probably very similar in Germany, but 80% of the prison population in Scotland has a reading age of 11 or under. And so there's a direct correlation between being failed by the education system, coming from a deprived background, and ending up in jail. So this is a big social problem and something that we are trying to tackle, but it is a very difficult scenario. What is interesting is that the research around how you begin to change these figures and to change these destinies ultimately concludes that reading promotions and education promotions over the last 20 years, at least in Scotland, have not bridged that gap, that attainment gap, and that the authors of this report is from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is a very prestigious research and charity organization. They say that the thing that will really make a difference at the end of the day and really change the figures is jobs for parents in deprived communities, because as soon as parents begin to, if you like, enjoy the structure of work, enjoy the purpose of work, enjoy the structure of that during their day in their lives and the salaries, then they begin to have more time and more aspiration for their own children. So that I found that very interesting.
Now to another question. In the time of the lockdown, in the time of the school closures, how did your institutions work? What was going on in this time for you? Could each of you tell me something about this?
Well, usually many of our projects, they end with a nice event with many people visiting. Like we have literature awards with children awarding the best book. For instance, some of our projects are about that, and of course we had to turn everything into digital, and also our own conferences, they were all turned into digital. I think many of you have had the same professional experience. And it was interesting sometimes how well this went, and how many children would be watching. At least if you look at the numbers, but it did feel like a big step away and a step down from what we usually do. And we have learned. We all have learned to widen the reach of our projects with streaming and stuff like that. But we did have problems, and so that's basically that's the general story. And maybe Simone.
Yeah, the German Reading Foundation reacted immediately and continuously. First of all, we established a platform, a digital platform on our website called Reading in Times of COVID-19. And there we first of all addressed families, parents, to help them to spend this time, this huge amount of time they had. And we had ideas how and what to read. We had free stories to read aloud, to read together with children, to be read by the children themselves. But we also addressed teachers in kindergartens and in schools, because in Germany we did not see that digital media had been very familiar for all of them. And we addressed a really important group for us, and that is volunteers. Volunteers, for example, read aloud to children in libraries, in kindergarten. But volunteers also work with groups of children. For example, we call them reading clubs, where children have a social community, where they have a place to be outside school and also outside family, to experience reading and other media. And from one day to the other, these volunteers were cut off from the contact with the children. And many of them, it's older people, people who are not so close to digital media too. And here we had a lot of material to get them into this process and to recontact the children and to work on a digital level with them. And we still support them by material, by ideas, and so on.
Yes, and that's a very similar picture to what we were able to do. I think we were fortunate in that we had already made a considerable investment in digital capability, so that when the lockdown came, we were able to pivot and to put a lot of great content and make it available on by digital means. There were advantages and disadvantages to that. We found that for certain kinds of conferences, we got more people tuning in digitally than we would get in person. So that was a good thing. We also did a lot of training for teachers and nursery workers. We trained over the period over 3,000 in Scotland. And we also took the opportunity to do a couple of other things that we felt were very important. We ran a survey. We have a research division to find out what reading did for people under lockdown, and as you can imagine, that was you know, the results of that were reinforce everything that we know about literature and about books. You know, well over 90% of people surveyed over a 10-week period said that it was good for their well-being, it was good for their family, it was good for their mental health, and it was an important activity. And I think a lot of people anyway reassessed life during lockdown, and I think that that was part of it. The other couple of things we did is, like Simone, we created a home learning hub that gave access to all of our content, all of our relevant content for families, for education, and for children of different ages, because we knew that they were being not able to go to school, and we wanted to place that content and those opportunities to families as easily downloadable and usable as possible. The other thing that we did, and this is because poverty and deprivation are a big part of our focus as a charity, is we became increasingly concerned about the number of families having to use food banks. And if you can imagine that in a 21st century society, you know, the demand for food banks has gone through the roof. And so what we were able to do is to get donations of books from publishers throughout the UK, link up with the third sector organizations that provided the food to these food banks, and distribute throughout lockdown and throughout the whole of last year, especially towards Christmas, over 100,000 free books to families using those food banks. And that is work that we're continuing to do today. And that is, I think, really, really important, because Simone was mentioning, you know, families without books in the home. You know, a book in the home is a transformational object, if you like, potentially. So getting books to families having to use food banks was something very, very important to us.
So we have done a lot in the times of the lockdown, but now the lockdown has mostly ended, and but the loss of the learning lost from the children are very high, and it's not counted in days and weeks but in months. And now the most vulnerable people, if you're already the most vulnerable children, as you already have told, are hidden the most. But yet now in many countries like the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Sweden, and Germany are among the countries in Europe that have provided specific packages to support continuity of learning and skills development. So now we are in Hessen, and Professor Ehmig, the Hessian Ministry has started the initiative Löwenstark Bildungskick. What kind of projects do you plan to promote reading now and after the pandemic with this fundings from Löwenstark?
Well, Löwenstark means in English strong as a lion. And this is a nice metaphor to describe the power of reading for the development of children, for their education chances, for their whole lives. And we are very proud to be part of this initiative. We ourselves do something Marc just mentioned, giving free books to children. Giving books to children in schools, to all children in schools in Hessen, in grades 1, 2, and 3 in December. And in next spring, also children grades 4 and 5 will get a book gift, and that is related to the celebration of the World Book Day in the end of April. Besides that, we are going to realize one very important program we have in schools. It is called Reading Scouts. Here, children who love reading are taught and are brought to others who are struggling readers. These children, these adolescents who love reading, they act as multipliers, as peers, motivating others, doing events, reading aloud to others, and so on, just to get a motivation to get into reading for the others.
And Daan, what about the grants from the government of Netherlands? Does Stichting Lesen benefit from the grants, and what do are doing?
Yeah, first I have to explain a little technical bit. We are related very much to education, and we work with education, but we're not funded by the educational department. We're funded by the cultural department. So there were grants going from the Ministry of Education to the schools, about 500 million. That's 500 million, I think, which they can spend on getting more professionals in the school to help children that fell back behind, or getting material to do so. We're not very connected to that. We are connected to the more cultural side, so we also got extra funding, which was part of it was spent on a program where language professionals, so writers, but also spoken word artists, hip-hop artists, we're given the possibility to organize workshops for young people. So let's say the creative professionals were to meet the young people online, but also, if it was possible, later in real life, so to say. So they could show how they were, how language had become their work, and why that is so important, and why it's fun. So the kids could do that kind of workshops, and we will continue that project. And another thing that happened during lockdown, but it wasn't funded by the government, it was from one of our commercial partners. They had a publicity campaign which was about, okay, everyone has to stay at home, so go and travel in a book. And it was really everywhere in the street. It was because advertisement became very cheap, because many companies weren't advertising that much anymore. So they never did a campaign like that before, and it was very much noticed. And later we'll talk about the numbers of readers, and maybe this campaign helped. So it was not all government funded.
Marc, what's about Scottish Book Trust? Do you benefit also from additional funds from the government?
We haven't had additional funds as such, because the real crisis has been for the performing arts. So organizations with venues that depend on ticket sales and performances have really suffered, as I imagine they have in Germany as well, and across Europe. And so the majority of the funding went to them and to practitioners, artists, and so on and so forth, just to keep them going during the time. That said, we do get very good support from the Scottish government. I should say, you know, Scotland's a small country of 5.5 million people, so it is possible for a charity like Scottish Book Trust to act really, truly nationally. We distribute to every single school in Scotland, and like the project that you were talking about, we gift books to children who start school in first, second, and third grade. They get a pack that supports their learning as well, has games and so on and so forth. So we're around about 70 staff, turning over around about £8 million a year. Around half of that comes from the Scottish government, and the rest comes from the Arts Council and private sources and trusts and foundations. So we haven't, in a sense, benefited from that, but we have emerged from the pandemic very, very strongly as an organization, and that is quite unusual story in these days, but I think it's primarily due to having a great brand, and having a brand that is trusted and recognized, producing world-class relevant content, and having the distribution channels, whether that is a physical distribution channel or a virtual one, that will get you into every nursery, every school, and so on and so forth. So I must say that we are in a strong position now, but you know, it's always a challenge.
So we come to another point, and that is the pandemic is putting a focus on already existing problems. And in Germany, that's the problem of the digitization, especially in Germany. And Professor Ehmig, you have already conducted a study about the importance of reading, but also on the use of digital media for information about COVID-19. Could you tell us about your findings?
Interesting that you called it the problem of digitization and not the chance of digitization. Yes, we have data based on a representative survey among adults in Germany from last winter. And there we asked for the importance of reading, and we especially focused on everyday reading. Reading, for example, just for information seeking, for communication, for making an appointment with an administrative office, and so on. Reading during the everyday life. And we also focused on the role of digital media, which have been, especially during the lockdown periods, the only way to get information about specific topics, more or less. What we have seen is that the access to information is absolutely depending on reading skills. Those adults who can be identified as struggling readers, as low-skilled readers, they have massive problems to find relevant information, especially in the context of COVID-19. We have this codes of conduct, we have information on vaccination and so on, which is really most important for them. But especially adults who had not good reading skills struggled with that a lot. And we have only 1 out of 3 saying it was easy to get this information. And in general, we see that people who are far from being good readers, they look at digitization with more or less only pessimism, not optimistically. They fear the complexity of information. They fear that texts are long. They are not able to go through them and in the end to know what they have read. And this is a huge problem because we have to prepare children, adolescents, adults for the digital world. And we must make sure that they are able to read there, because we know in the digital world we need reading skills as much as never before.
So, Marc, you have you have also the problems, but you have more digitized in the school lockdowns and the school closures. And what are the results there?
Yes, it's a mixed picture in Scotland because if you've ever been to Scotland, you know that it's quite a challenging landscape and there's quite remote communities and so on and so forth. So there is a big program of building broadband digital to the remoter areas where sometimes they don't have that. As for children, we do recommend. I mean, we very much believe that young children should be handling a book, whether they're chewing the edge of the book, you know, whether they're throwing it, you know, whether they're dribbling on it, whatever, you know. I mean, it's all great, it's all good. We don't want those young children to be doing that digitally. There are important aspects of motor skills that are developed through handling books and all of that. So a little bit further on, you know, particularly around secondary school, when kids get mobile phones, you know, and they start, you know, in their teenage lives, you very much see a drop off in reading standards, and that's because these kids are, you know, on social media and all of that. And that's a bit of a problem. I'm not sure it's you know, you're sort of swimming against the tide here in terms of trying to provide reasons why they should dial that back and get back into reading. But we do our best. And I think that, again, there are advantages and disadvantages of being connected. I think research in the future will show which way that goes. But generally speaking, I think that keeping on, there are lots of studies, for example, about reading text on a screen or reading it off a book. What that does in terms of your episodic memory, how far that goes in, how you process that. These are all important things that we need to hold on to, and that the educational system struggles with. I do want to make just one other point about the educational system that we have, at least, is that if you look at it in one way, it could actually be, particularly for children from deprived backgrounds, creating non-readers. So education is creating non-readers. And the reason for that is because children are coming to school at the age of 5 with poor language development. Then the teacher says, we're going to teach you how to read and write English, which is actually quite a complicated language. And they struggle for 2.5 years, and they don't master it properly. And then we come along at the end and say, hey, do you love books? And they go, what are you talking about? This is an instrument of torture. So there is a structural problem there. And Scottish Book Trust believes that, along a Scandinavian model, that really we should be delaying the formal teaching of learning how to read and write until at least 7 years old.
Daan, the Netherlands were well prepared for homeschooling because they are well digitized, the schools. But is this right? Did it work well?
Well, for this question, we do have a good infrastructure as it goes for getting digital books from the library. So that's what I've looked into for you for this question. That's a different topic than the discussion that was going on here, because we as reading promoters also try to form an educated meaning about whether digital sources are chances or dangerous. And I think you've both been you've talked about both sides, about the chances it gives and also the danger it has with young kids only seeing screens, and that doesn't work. So I agree with that, and we try to form an opinion on that as well. And there's many studies that Stichting Lezen has published that you can look up to find out what our thoughts about that are. I'm not going into that now because I did look up the digital library numbers because that's of course also interesting. And during lockdown, because libraries were of course closed, the physical libraries, but people did have access to the digital library, which is very much promoted. And no less than, there was a 44% increase, which means 5.6 million digital books were taken from the digital library. And I must say, unfortunately, I was talking to Marc this morning, libraries are not for free in the Netherlands. So again, if you look at this, you could be like, oh, that's great, people still have access to books, but you do have to pay your subscription, which depends where you live, can be around 25 euros, or maybe if you're lucky, 15. So again, this is people who can miss the 25 euros, who can take out the digital books. Also, digital are audiobooks. There was also an increase there. I won't mention the number. And 160,000 people installed the digital app. I mean, we are with around 70 million people, so it's just 1%, I think. Is that right? Yeah, or less. I'm not good at numbers. I think that's 1%. All in all, still, you could say, well, you were lucky. I mean, they were lending digital books instead of taking out digital books instead of the real ones. But all in all, the numbers went down. If you look at the left and right, you make the final calculation. There was a decrease. What we also saw was sales were going up of digital books, but also real books. And then the problem is that people found their way to the biggest online bookseller, which it's not Amazon in the Netherlands. It's called bol.com. And many people know to find their way there, which meant that the physical bookshop around the corner even if they were selling digital books as well, people or most people would not buy it there. So the bookshops were actually suffering from the success of the bigger salesmen on the internet, which is of course a global issue. And then there's, on a positive note, just one study indicated that all in all, people read more during lockdowns and during Corona crisis, and also children were read to more at home by their parents, probably because they were at home and looking for stuff to do. And by the way, we also had all kinds of resources to help parents find materials, and so there is some positive news there.
Sorry, I wanted to give a slightly better answer to the digital question. One of our strategies is using social media to bring kids back to books. So if you can produce entertaining content that gets them interested in a particular author or a particular book, then that is a way in, using the overwhelming kind of strength of digital media. So we have an app for teenagers where they can share tips about books that they really enjoy, and can access information on the other kinds of books that they might enjoy. And we have a collaboration with the BBC where we do author events with the very best children's authors live, and those are streamed directly into schools. So I think you have to use film, you have to use digital media, you have to use all apps, all these kinds of things to just keep on reminding kids, actually this stuff is really good, this is really entertaining.
Now we're coming to another point that's a little bit relating to this too, and it's the children have got a lot of psychological problems, and now I have had really nice comment from Prisco Piscitelli, the UNESCO Chair on Health, Education and Sustainable Development, and she said, "Reading stories, especially fantasy, is a social vaccination against all the restrictions because they help children find a way to exit what COVID-19 put into play." So, first, Professor Ehmig, you have a lot of experience about the reading conditions and all of the importance of book. Can you confirm this statement?
Of course, yeah, it's the stories giving children role models. Children learn by listening, by reading stories, how people can behave, which problems they may face, and how they can handle it, how they can solve them, how they interact with each other, and so on. And by getting into these stories, they learn to take others seriously. They learn to think in the way others might think. They become. Now I'm looking more empathetic. That was the word I missed. Thank you. And in that sense, it's really a social vaccination. That's true.
Yes. Same is true for adults, of course.
A remedy.
I think books are definitely a remedy. We've just started a very big program that trains carers who are looking after a parent or a relative, or in a care home even, who are looking after people with dementia. We have found through a lot of research and a lot of testing to start off with that is a really effective way of actually having some sort of interaction and some sort of benefit. So the therapeutics of reading are increasingly apparent, and just reading 15 minutes a day reduces your stress. It takes you out of the world and into another world. But as Simone was saying, the main thing about it is it allows you to imagine, and particularly for children, it allows you to put yourself into somebody else's shoes and to experience everything that they've experienced in a safe space, you know, a space that's safe for that child. So, you know, that is absolutely fantastic. You know, it's brilliant.
And would you?
Yeah, yes, I agree, and a little bit I disagree as well. I think reading is a therapy, and a couple of years ago we actually started a website which is completely based on that theory, so to say. And the website is called something like, it's called Lezen Beter in Dutch, which is something like cure yourself by reading a book. And we got a lot of comments also from the medical world, because we were speaking to the medical world as well. Like, do you use books to talk to children when they have psychological issues, or how does that work? And they told us to be cautious, because if a kid is depressed, it can really help it can help the kid to read a book about maybe a kid who's also depressed, and find out she's not the only one. And it can also help for kids in her surroundings or his surroundings to know what it's like to be depressed. So and it can help the parents who maybe don't understand why the kid is depressed, or what that is actually. But then one doctor said, but depression is a real illness, and you don't just cure it by reading a book. So you have to be a bit careful there. And I mean, I think reading is most important in life, and I would like it to be a miracle medicine, and I do think it helps. So I do disagree. I do agree, but we should be careful not to think it's the cure for everything. I mean, and in the way I just explained, it does really help. So let's all help the kids by reading those kinds of books as well.
No, I mean, I would certainly agree that you don't want to overclaim, but nevertheless, I think the therapeutics of it are very, very strong. Just in terms of, you know, there's a funny story. I had a Chinese publisher delegation come visit us in Scotland, and the first question was, do you by law have to read?
So we are now coming to the end of the panel, but I don't want to miss to ask about the differences. There are a lot of studies who say in lockdown, in times of lockdown, the people have read more, and then otherwise we read they have read less. What's now the reality? So each of you.
Certainly from our survey, I think that we have shown, although it is a survey, you know, amongst 200 people over 10 weeks, under lockdown, strict lockdown, you know, where cities were like, what's happened, you know. So yes, of course, I think that also publishers in Britain have seen their book sales go up. I think it's part of a larger re-examination of what is actually important in life that a lot of people have gone through, you know, under the sort of living conditions that we are now. And part of that is to look at things that are that take a little, you know, that aren't instant gratification, that take a little bit of work and you know, a little longer to get to. And part of that is reading. And so I think that particularly when people feel embattled, you know, by a pandemic and not being able to go out or whatever, you know, opening a book is a wonderful way of traveling without moving.
The figures for Germany show that there is an increase in reading time, and also book sales are going up, or went up. I would be careful to say it's everyone increasing reading time, because I would assume that it's especially the part of the population who has been reading before and intensified reading. And some parts, some people who rediscovered, we all know all the books in our bookshelves we have never read or we want to read again. But I'm sure that there are parts of the population far from books who don't have books at home who are not familiar in reading books, here we will not see this change, and we will not have the data to confirm that.
I would just completely agree with that. I think the situation in the Netherlands is exactly the same. The numbers indicate that that reading time went up and sales went up, and well, loans in the library all in all went down a bit. But I agree. I mean, it's not everyone, and especially the people who don't read, they actually fell back. So there's less. There's some children that would have been maybe turned into readers that were not during the pandemic. So.
We have also a social reading gap for this, and so we have something to do against this. So my last personal question is, what's your favorite book to have as a remedy?
Goodness me, that's a difficult question. I mean, I've read so much, and particularly over the last 2 years, and just had an absolutely wonderful time with it all. I'm gonna have to pass on that one. You'll have to let me think of it.
To be honest, at the moment, there is no book on the bedside table.
Okay, well, I'll have a tip. I read Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro during COVID, and I loved it. And it's a bit about a digital world and what makes us human and what doesn't. And it's also a bit about education and trying to they're really upgrading kids in that world. And it's very interesting read. I don't know if it was therapeutical for me, but it's a nice book.
And I thought about it. You read books for different reasons. So some books are, big meals, and other books are just snacks, And when you want comfort, you go back to the snack, don't you? So my sort of comfort snack, and I read and reread his novels every year, is Ian M. Banks, his science fiction in particular. He died of cancer, unfortunately, a few years ago, but he was certainly a great writer, and it's fun.
Thank you very much. I think now everyone has a little bit of impression what's going on in different European countries. And thanks a lot for the audience, and thanks for you, and have a nice day on the book fair. Bye.
And please feel free to come up and ask questions if you like.